August 25, 1944, northern France. 3 weeks after breaking out of Normandy, General George S. Patton's Third Army had driven nearly 400 miles across occupied territory. Its armored spearheads were already south and east of Paris, cutting across German retreat corridors faster than higher headquarters could redraw the maps. The German army in the west was no longer retreating in formation. It was dissolving. Columns abandoned trucks, artillery, even tanks, clogging secondary roads with wreckage as they fled east toward the German frontier. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, Commander-in-Chief West, reported to Adolf Hitler that the Wehrmacht in France was finished as a coherent force. Between Patton's lead elements and Germany itself stood no continuous defensive line, no prepared river barrier, no organized operational reserve. American armored divisions were advancing so fast that forward air controllers lost contact with the front. Tank commanders drove beyond the limits of their issued maps, navigating by road signs and instinct. In some sectors, units covered 30 miles a day through gaps the German command could not close. The question was no longer whether the Allies would reach Germany. It was how quickly they could exploit what looked like total collapse. Momentum became doctrine. Patton understood the risk. Third Army was consuming nearly 400,000 gallons of fuel every day. Its supply lines stretched back to the Normandy beaches. The Red Ball Express ran without pause, drivers pushing trucks through exhaustion and darkness to keep armor moving forward. But for the moment, the gamble worked. Paris lay ahead. Beyond Paris lay open country leading straight to the German border. Then, on the day the road was open, the advance stopped. Not because of German resistance, not because of logistics, because of a phone call from Paris. The margin was now measured in days. 6 weeks earlier, none of this looked possible. In June and early July of 1944, American forces were still trapped in the Normandy bocage. Every field was a fortress. Every hedgerow was a prepared defensive position, reinforced with machine guns, mortars, and interlocking fire. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards. Casualties were measured in thousands. German infantry divisions, though battered, used the terrain with ruthless efficiency. American units learned that a single hedgerow could cost an entire platoon. Paris felt impossibly distant. That changed on July 25th. Operation Cobra began west of Saint-Lô with a concentrated aerial bombardment unlike anything previously attempted in the campaign. When the dust cleared, General Omar Bradley's U.S. First Army punched a hole through German lines that could not be sealed. On August 1st, Patton's Third Army became operational. It did not pause to consolidate. Armor poured through the gap, fanning south and east in a wide exploitation that German commanders had neither the reserves nor the fuel to counter. Divisions that doctrine said should advance cautiously, instead raced forward, bypassing resistance and leaving pockets of German troops to be mopped up later. By mid-August, German situation reports admitted the obvious. There was no operational solution. Patton's armor moved faster than communications, faster than supply doctrine, faster than German command could react. Momentum replaced caution, and momentum created a new kind of danger. Third Army's advance was now outrunning its fuel. The farther it drove, the thinner the margin became. Every mile forward increased the risk of a forced halt. But as long as the road stayed open, Patton believed the risk was worth it. Because collapse, once exploited, does not return, unless given time. The margin was beginning to narrow, speed at a cost. By mid-August 1944, Patton's Third Army was consuming fuel faster than any logistical plan had anticipated. Nearly 400,000 gallons a day vanished into tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and recovery vehicles pushing east. The supply line stretched more than 400 miles back to the Normandy beaches. Every gallon had to travel that distance on rubber tires. The Red Ball Express ran 24 hours a day. African-American drivers, many working without headlights, pushed overloaded trucks through exhaustion to keep the advance alive. Breakdowns littered the roads. Drivers slept where they collapsed. Even at maximum effort, supply could not match Patton's pace. By August 20th, Third Army staff officers were reporting fuel levels that made sustained operations mathematically impossible. Some armored battalions had less than a day's worth of gasoline on hand. Patton refused to slow. He ordered commanders to keep moving until tanks physically ran dry. Momentum, he believed, mattered more than caution. A stopped army, even a supplied one, lost initiative. For the moment, his gamble worked. German forces in France were no longer maneuvering. They were fleeing. One tank commander from the 4th Armored Division wrote home that the Germans smelled of panic. Columns scattered at the sound of engines. Roads clogged with abandoned equipment told the same story. The men ran on adrenaline, caffeine, and certainty. They believed the war could end before winter. They believed Berlin was no longer a destination, but a schedule problem. Paris now sat directly in their path. Beyond it lay open country, rolling east toward the Moselle and the German frontier. No major river barrier had been prepared. No fortified line stood ready. For the first time since Normandy, the enemy was not dictating terms. Time was. And time was running out. While Allied commanders argued over Paris, the German High Command made a critical decision. On August 17, 1944, Adolf Hitler sent Field Marshal Walter Model west with emergency authority to salvage what remained of the German army in France. Model was known as a specialist in disaster. He arrived to find exactly that. German units were scattered, leaderless, and retreating in fragments. Command structures had collapsed. Entire divisions existed only on paper. Under normal conditions, there was nothing to save. Then Model noticed something unexpected. The American advance was slowing. Not because German resistance had stiffened, because American forces were halting on their own. Reports from Model's chief of staff confirmed it. U.S. units approaching Paris had paused. They were not attacking. They were waiting. For Model, the implication was immediate. He ordered every surviving formation to disengage and move east. Equipment that could not be moved was abandoned. What mattered was manpower. Units were directed toward the Moselle River and the German frontier. Skeleton garrisons were rushed back into the West Wall, the Siegfried Line fortifications that had been stripped of heavy weapons earlier in the war. Every day mattered. Positions that a week earlier were empty now received troops. Roadblocks became defensive lines. Retreat turned into reorganization. German commanders who had been fleeing in panic suddenly had time. Time to regroup. Time to establish fields of fire. Time to prepare for the battles they knew were coming. Model's logistics staff later calculated the effect. The pause between August 20th and August 27th prevented total destruction of German forces in the West. What had looked like collapse became resistance, and the enemy understood exactly why. The Americans had given them a week. For Charles de Gaulle, Paris was never just a city. It was the symbol upon which France's future would be decided. Who liberated Paris would define who governed France when the war ended. By August 1944, de Gaulle had waited 4 years for this moment. The Free French leader understood that military victory without political legitimacy was meaningless. On August 19th, the Paris resistance rose in open revolt. Barricades appeared in the streets. German patrols came under fire. Civilians began dying in full view of the world. De Gaulle moved immediately. On August 21st, he met Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower. His demand was direct. French forces must liberate Paris. Not American, not British, French. Eisenhower explained the military reality. Patton's Third Army was positioned to cut off German escape routes east of the city. American forces could isolate and secure Paris within days without diverting the main advance. From a purely operational standpoint, Paris was irrelevant. De Gaulle was unmoved. He did not argue tactics. He argued legitimacy. France had been occupied since 1940. The French people needed to see French soldiers reclaiming their capital. Anything else risked reducing France to a liberated territory rather than a sovereign power. Then de Gaulle issued his threat. If Eisenhower refused, de Gaulle would order General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division into Paris anyway. He would break the Allied chain of command. Either way, the advance toward Germany would stop. Eisenhower had faced this dilemma before: military efficiency versus coalition unity, victory on the battlefield versus stability after it. He understood Washington's position. The alliance came first, and Paris, whether the generals liked it or not, was about to become the center of gravity. Inside Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the issue was no longer theoretical. Eisenhower understood the military cost immediately. Halting Patton meant surrendering initiative at the precise moment German forces were breaking apart. But Paris introduced a second danger. Inside the city, the German military governor, General Dietrich von Choltitz, held direct orders from Hitler. If Paris could not be held, it was to be destroyed. Bridges were wired with explosives. Key monuments were prepared for demolition. The uprising that began on August 19th made delay increasingly dangerous. Eisenhower briefed General Omar Bradley. The situation was blunt. De Gaulle demanded that French forces enter Paris first. This required stopping the American advance and diverting fuel, ammunition, and transport to support the French 2nd Armored Division. Bradley objected immediately. His armies were on the verge of breaking into Germany. Every day of delay allowed German units to regroup east of the Seine. Paris could be liberated after the war was effectively won. From a military standpoint, Bradley was correct. Eisenhower did not disagree. But he also knew President Roosevelt's priorities. France had to emerge from liberation as a functioning ally, not a resentful client state. Alienating de Gaulle now would poison relations for months, possibly years. Eisenhower weighed the risks. Urban combat in Paris carried political danger. A destroyed capital would be a catastrophe. A fractured alliance would be worse. The decision was made. General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division would liberate Paris. American forces would support the operation but remain largely outside the city. Fuel and supplies would be diverted. The eastward drive would pause. Bradley passed the order down the chain. Third Army would halt. When the message reached Patton's headquarters, the meaning was clear. The road to Germany was being closed, not by the enemy, by order. The decisive moment did not occur at the front. It happened inside headquarters rooms, over maps already outdated by Patton's speed. Eisenhower did not issue a dramatic proclamation. There was no speech, no flourish. The decision came as a matter-of-fact directive, framed in the language of coalition necessity. Paris would be liberated by French forces. General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division would enter the city first. American units would support the operation but remain outside the capital. Fuel, transport, and logistical priority would shift accordingly. The advance toward Germany would pause. Eisenhower understood exactly what he was trading. He was not choosing Paris over victory. He was choosing alliance cohesion over operational momentum. To Eisenhower, the war was larger than a single breakthrough. It was a political enterprise carried by military force. If France emerged humiliated or sidelined, the post-war settlement would fracture before it began. Bradley received the order without argument. He knew the logic, even if he rejected the cost. Patton did not. When Third Army headquarters was informed, the reaction was immediate and furious. Patton believed momentum was a weapon that once lost could not be regained. He had an open road, a broken enemy, and tanks pointed east. Now he was being told to stop. Fuel allocations were redirected. Supply convoys were reassigned. Units that had been advancing daily were ordered to hold their positions. Patton would later say that the war could have ended in 1944. He believed the pause at Paris bought Germany the time it needed. Eisenhower never disputed the consequence. He accepted it. Because the alternative was a political rupture he believed the Allies could not afford. The order went out. The guns fell silent. And across the German lines, men who had been running now began to dig in. On August 25, 1944, French forces entered Paris. General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division rolled through the city as church bells rang across the capital. Crowds flooded the streets. Tricolor flags appeared from windows that had been shuttered for 4 years. Inside Notre Dame Cathedral, Charles de Gaulle declared France liberated. The images traveled instantly. Paris became the symbol of Allied victory in Western Europe. The political objective was achieved. What the photographs did not show was what stopped. East of the city, Patton's tanks sat motionless along French roads. Engines were silent. Crews waited beside vehicles with fuel gauges already dipping toward empty. Logistics shifted immediately. The Red Ball Express diverted thousands of tons of supplies toward Paris. French forces required ammunition, fuel, and rations. The city itself needed nearly 4,000 tons of food, coal, and medical supplies per day to prevent humanitarian collapse. Every truck entering Paris was a truck not reaching the front. Eyewitnesses later described American soldiers watching supply convoys turn around. Jerry cans meant for tanks instead fueled ceremonial movement and urban stabilization. Patton's supply officers calculated the loss. The resources consumed supporting the liberation could have carried Third Army nearly 100 miles farther east, far enough to cross the Moselle River before German defenses solidified. While champagne was poured in Paris, momentum bled away on the roads beyond it. German reconnaissance noticed immediately. American formations were no longer advancing, they were waiting. The pause was no longer theoretical, it was visible. And on the far side of the line, German commanders began using every hour they had been given. The celebration lasted a day. The consequences would last months. When Patton's tanks finally moved again on August 28th, the change was immediate. The open chase was gone. Instead of fleeing columns and abandoned vehicles, American vanguards met prepared anti-tank positions. Road junctions were covered by guns. Approaches were registered by artillery. The Moselle River, which a week earlier could have been crossed with pontoon bridges under light opposition, now bristled with fire. German units occupied both banks. Crossings became contested battles. Third Army intelligence reports told the story. Formations that had been running in disorder days earlier were now dug in along successive defensive lines. Elements of the West Wall, the Siegfried Line, were manned again, reinforced with infantry and whatever heavy weapons could be scraped together. The transformation was stark. What had been chaos hardened into resistance. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. The Red Ball Express could not recover from the diversion to Paris. As September began, Patton's armored divisions approached the German frontier with fuel allocations measured in hours rather than days. Then came the order. In early September, Third Army was instructed to halt offensive operations indefinitely. Fuel priority was shifting north. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's forces in Belgium now received logistical precedence. The Allied focus moved away from Patton's drive east. Patton's tanks stopped again. This time, they stopped 100 miles short of the Rhine. German forces used September exactly as Model intended. Fresh divisions arrived from Germany, defensive works were expanded, minefields multiplied. The chance to carry momentum across the frontier vanished. The road that had been open in August was now closed, and reopening it would cost far more than speed. By September 1944, the nature of the war had changed. The rapid advance across France ended at the concrete teeth of the West Wall. Pillboxes controlled every approach. Fields of fire overlapped with precision learned from 4 years of fortification. American units that had raced forward in August now fought for yards. Third Army's infantry assaulted positions designed to be taken slowly, with artillery and time. The time had already been spent. Battles in Lorraine became attritional. Each crossing of a stream or road junction required deliberate preparation. Casualties mounted with every attempt. Officers who had expected open maneuver now planned assaults measured in platoons rather than divisions. The contrast with August was brutal. German commanders understood what they had gained. Post-war interrogations confirmed it. The pause at Paris had provided the exact interval needed to reconstitute defenses. Without it, several German generals admitted, organized resistance west of the Rhine would have been impossible. Autumn arrived. The clear skies of the summer pursuit vanished, replaced by rain, mud, and falling temperatures. Supply became harder. Movement slowed further. The war that could have ended in 1944 did not. Third Army would not resume sustained offensive operations until November. By then, German positions were fully prepared, and losses escalated accordingly. The cost was not abstract. Tens of thousands of American casualties accumulated fighting through terrain that would have been bypassed weeks earlier. Units that might have crossed into Germany unopposed now bled against reinforced lines. The week bought at Paris had compounded into months, and the balance sheet was written in names. The delay did not end in Lorraine. It extended into winter. As American forces ground forward through the West Wall in October and November, German commanders used the time they had preserved. Divisions were rebuilt. Fuel and ammunition were stockpiled. Plans were drawn in secrecy. Field Marshal Walter Model remained at the center of it. The same officer who had exploited the August pause now oversaw preparations for a counterstroke. The Ardennes, battered and under strength, offered one last opportunity. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched the Battle of the Bulge. The offensive used formations that had survived because of the weak gained in late August. Units reorganized behind the Moselle and reinforced along the West Wall were now thrown west again. American casualties exceeded 80,000. The winter that Patton believed could have been avoided arrived in full force. The soldiers, who might have been home by Christmas, instead froze in foxholes. Supply lines strained under snow and ice. The war entered its most punishing phase. German generals interviewed after the war were direct. Without the pause at Paris, they argued, the Ardennes offensive would not have been possible at all. It was not a claim of victory. It was an admission of survival. The political decision made in August had rippled forward into December. The cost was no longer measured in miles or fuel. It was measured in lives. Winter had been paid for in advance. The images from Paris endure. French soldiers marching down the Champs-Élysées, crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder. Charles de Gaulle standing in Notre Dame declaring France restored. Those photographs became history. They defined France's post-war narrative and secured its political future. They showed liberation, unity, and sovereignty reclaimed. What they did not show lay east of the city. They did not show American tanks idling with empty fuel tanks on French roads. They did not show infantrymen waiting in mud while supply trucks turned away from the front. They did not show German units using borrowed time to rebuild. Eisenhower preserved the alliance. De Gaulle secured legitimacy. The political objectives were real and lasting. So were the consequences. The pause at Paris ensured the war in Western Europe would not end in 1944. The chance to turn collapse into conclusion passed in a single week. Instead came the Siegfried Line, the Battle of the Bulge, and a winter of attrition. American forces paid for time in blood and cold. This was not a mistake in ignorance. It was a choice made with full awareness of the trade. Military momentum was exchanged for political stability. History remembers the celebration. The cost is written elsewhere, in the snow of the Ardennes.